Imagine this. You wake up in a world where you've achieved everything they told you to want. Success, recognition, intelligence, even admiration. You're respected in your field, sharp in debate, and fluent in the languages of logic and reason. Yet, when the day ends and the noise fades, there's a silence that lingers, not just around you, but within. A quiet that isn't peaceful, but heavy. Because despite all you've accomplished, despite the accolades and insights, you find yourself strangely detached from something everyone else seems to crave. Connection. Not love, not friendship, but the social life. Parties, gatherings, small talk, group chats, reunions. The rituals of belonging. You realize you don't miss it. In fact, you might even feel relief when you cancel plans, and yet a voice inside whispers, "Is this normal? Is this healthy?" Why do so many intelligent people seem to drift away from social life, not out of shyness or trauma, but by choice? Think about the people you know who are deeply thoughtful, fiercely independent, or profoundly insightful. Chances are, they don't spend their weekends chasing validation at dinner parties or scrolling through curated lives on social media. They're not antisocial, nor are they unkind, but they choose solitude over conformity, quiet over chaos, depth over distraction. And here lies the paradox. Society tells us that success is measured in relationships, influence, popularity. We're taught that being well-connected is synonymous with being well-adjusted. So why do those who see through illusions often end up walking alone? Could it be that the more you understand the world, the less you feel at home in it? Could it be that clarity isolates? This isn't about arrogance or superiority. It's deeper. It's existential. It's as if the very act of thinking clearly, of seeing beyond surface-level interactions, creates a kind of exile, a quiet exile from the shared delusions that keep most people anchored to each other. But what happens to someone who no longer believes in those illusions? What happens to a mind that sees too much? And more importantly, why does this pattern repeat across history, across cultures, across disciplines? Because it's not just modern times. Thinkers like Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, even Socrates, they were all outsiders, not because they wanted to be, but because they had to be. Their minds couldn't fit into the mold of ordinary social existence. So now ask yourself, if intelligence leads to isolation, is ignorance truly bliss? Or is there something more profound waiting beneath this contradiction? Something we've been avoiding because it challenges everything we think we know about happiness, connection, and the meaning of life itself. Let's go deeper. What if the loneliness of intelligence isn't a flaw, but a side effect? It's tempting to believe that social life is a universal need, as essential as food or sleep. But what if it's not? What if, for some minds, the noise of crowds, the weight of expectations, and the dance of superficiality become unbearable not because they're broken, but because they're awake? This is where Arthur Schopenhauer enters the scene, not with comforting answers, but with brutal clarity. Schopenhauer saw human society as a theater of illusions, a grand performance where people wear masks, speak in scripts, and pretend at meaning to avoid staring into the abyss of existential emptiness. To him, most of what passes for connection is just mutual distraction, a shared refusal to face the raw truth of existence, and so, the intelligent mind recoils, not out of arrogance, but awareness. The more you understand about the world, the fragility of human motives, the randomness of fate, the absurdity of social hierarchies, the harder it becomes to play along. You begin to see through the rituals, the performative laughter, the empty gestures, the endless competition masked as camaraderie. You realize that much of social life is built on borrowed emotions, recycled beliefs, and a desperate clinging to belonging. Carl Jung once wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that matter. That's the hidden wound." Not the absence of people, but the absence of meaning in their presence. Friedrich Nietzsche echoed this sentiment when he warned against the herd instinct, the unconscious pull toward conformity that dulls individuality and muffles thought. For Nietzsche, the crowd doesn't just limit freedom, it poisons depth. And those who seek truth often find themselves exiled by those who fear it. Then there's Viktor Frankl, who survived the horror of concentration camps only to conclude that meaning, not pleasure or power, is the deepest human drive. But what happens when your search for meaning leads you away from the very structures that others cling to for comfort? You become an outsider, quietly, unavoidably. Because here's the deeper truth. Intelligence doesn't just change how you think, it changes how you feel. It rewires your nervous system to detect falsity, to reject shallow exchanges, to crave substance over spectacle. And in a world that rewards surface-level connection, that sensitivity becomes a kind of exile. So ask yourself, is your solitude a curse or a symptom of seeing too clearly? And if that's true, then what comes next? What happens when isolation turns into alienation? When insight becomes a burden rather than a gift? We're only beginning to scratch the surface of the unseen consequences. Now that you've glimpsed the quiet exile of intelligence, let's pull back the curtain further. Because this detachment doesn't just shape your weekends or your social calendar, it shapes your entire reality. The intelligent mind, once unmoored from the illusions of the crowd, begins to see patterns where others see chaos. You start noticing how most people live on autopilot, driven not by choice, but by conditioning. Social norms become cages, conversations turn into echoes, and what passes for connection is often just shared distraction dressed in the illusion of intimacy. This isn't cynicism, it's clarity. And here's the consequence. The more you see, the less you feel at home anywhere. You begin to question everything: relationships, institutions, even your own place in the world. You realize that many people are not seeking truth. They're seeking comfort, not meaning, but distraction, not freedom, but routine. And when you no longer share those desires, you drift, not out of arrogance, but necessity. Psychologists call this phenomenon cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of holding conflicting beliefs. But what happens when your entire worldview conflicts with the world itself? You become a stranger in your own life. Neurologically, this makes sense. Highly intelligent individuals often have heightened sensitivity to emotional and sensory input. They process more information, detect inconsistencies faster, and form deeper associations. In short, their minds don't just think differently, they feel differently, which means the pain of inauthenticity hits harder. The noise of superficiality grates louder. The emptiness behind smiles cuts deeper. And so, you retreat. Not because you don't care, but because you care too much. But here's the danger. Prolonged isolation doesn't just protect, it distorts. Left unchecked, clarity can harden into cynicism. Insight can curdle into alienation. And the very intelligence that liberated you becomes the force that imprisons you in your own mind. You stop reaching out, not because you don't want to connect, but because every attempt feels like speaking a language no one else understands. You begin to believe that depth is rare, that meaning is fleeting, that true connection is a myth. And maybe worst of all, you start to wonder if you're broken for feeling this way. But you're not broken. You're simply seeing through the veil. And now comes the real question. If intelligence leads to isolation, and isolation breeds disillusionment, how do you reclaim your humanity without losing your mind? How do you reconnect with others, with yourself, with the world, without betraying your truth? Because there is a way, a rebellion, a return, a redefinition. Let's uncover it together. So you've seen the pattern. You understand now. Intelligence isn't a curse, but it can become one if left unchecked. It can turn insight into exile, awareness into alienation. But here's the radical truth. You don't have to live like this. You are not trapped by your mind. You are only waiting for the right rebellion. Because the moment you recognize the illusion, you gain the power to reshape it. This is not about becoming more social, not in the way society defines it. That would be a betrayal of everything we've uncovered. No, this is about something deeper, something far more dangerous to the status quo. It's about reclaiming connection on your own terms. Think of it as a quiet revolution, a refusal to play by rules that were never meant for minds like yours. Schopenhauer himself didn't reject people out of hatred. He rejected the pretense. He withdrew not because he despised humanity, but because he saw through its masks and could no longer tolerate the falsity they hid behind. But what if withdrawal doesn't have to mean surrender? What if instead it becomes strategy? History is filled with those who walked alone, but not all of them were lost. Nietzsche wandered the Alps and wrote some of the most profound critiques of modern life. Thoreau lived in solitude at Walden Pond and discovered truths about society that still echo today. Emily Dickinson wrote poetry from the shadows of her home, and yet her voice reached millions. They didn't conform. They didn't seek validation, but they created . And in doing so, they redefined what connection even means. So ask yourself, must connection always be loud? Must it always be frequent? Must it always be mutual? Or can it be rare, deep, and meaningful, even if it spans centuries? The rebellion begins when you stop measuring your worth by how many people follow you and start measuring it by how deeply you live. It starts when you choose quality over quantity, when you stop chasing approval and start cultivating relationships that feel like oxygen, not obligation, when you speak less but say more, when you listen not to respond but to understand, when you create not for likes but for legacy. And perhaps most importantly, it starts when you stop apologizing for being different, because here's the final secret. Intelligence doesn't isolate you from the world. It isolates you from the wrong version of the world. But when you find the right people, the ones who think like you, feel like you, question like you, suddenly the silence isn't lonely anymore. It's sacred. So build your own tribe, not one bound by geography or convenience, but by depth, meaning, and shared vision. Seek out the thinkers, the artists, the rebels, the ones who see the world not as it is, but as it could be. And above all, live deliberately. Because the next step isn't just about breaking free. It's about building something better. You are not alone because you are broken. You are alone because you are whole. That is the final truth, the one that shatters everything and rebuilds it in silence. Think back to what society told you connection should look like. Parties, conversations, shared routines, mutual validation. But what if none of that was ever about true connection at all? What if the real loneliness, the deepest exile, was not yours, but theirs? Because most people are not connected to themselves. They are fragmented, shaped by trends, molded by expectations, driven by fear rather than vision. They live lives borrowed from others, speaking words they've heard, feeling emotions they've been taught, believing truths that were handed down without question. And you saw through it. You felt the dissonance before you could name it. You sensed the emptiness behind the smiles, the noise covering up the silence inside. You withdrew not out of weakness but strength, because it takes courage to stop pretending. And now, standing on the edge of this realization, you see the ultimate paradox. The more you understand the world, the less it understands you. But that's not a failure. It's a signpost. It means you have touched something deeper than comfort, something beyond approval. You have brushed against the raw fabric of existence, and it changed you. Schopenhauer warned us. Life swings between pain and boredom. But he also pointed toward a third path, one carved by those who refuse to be ruled by either, those who choose meaning over distraction, depth over conformity, and truth over illusion. You are walking that path now. And though it may seem solitary, it is not empty. Because every thinker who has ever mattered walked beside ghosts, those who came before, those who will come after. Every writer who spoke into the void knew they might never hear an echo in their lifetime. Every artist who poured their soul onto canvas did so knowing the world might never see it. Yet they created anyway. Because true connection does not always happen in real time. Sometimes it happens across centuries. Sometimes it happens in silence. Sometimes it happens in solitude. And that solitude becomes the very thing that binds you to the rest of humanity. So do not seek belonging in the crowd. Seek resonance in the rare. Speak only when it matters. Create as if no one is watching, because the only eyes that matter are the ones that will see you, truly, long after you're gone. And above all, do not apologize for seeing too clearly, because clarity is not a curse. It is a calling. Now go forward, not as someone lost in isolation, but as someone chosen by insight, and build your world.